I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. This week on the Poetry of Predicament podcast, we have Melody LeBaron. And Melody turns out to be just a remarkable fit with my own body of work. We both have worked for decades on cultivating a special set of skills and sensitivities that turn out to be very, very useful in these extraordinarily trying times. Melody has deepened her work to now be working with people as they approach the death and dying process. I hope you'll find this as interesting and as deep as I did. Melody LeBaron. Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast. I am your ever-present host, Dean Walker, and it is a gorgeous day here in beautiful downtown Medford, Oregon, Southern Oregon on the USA. And I am very pleased to be introducing and interviewing today Melody LeBaron. And Melody and I met in a recent 5 Saturdays in April course that I offered here in Living Resilience World. A little bit difficult to describe. I'll put some details and some contact information for the recordings only version, so you'll be able to get a sense of the course we're talking about. But suffice it to say that it's for the collapse aware community, no matter where you come in on Paul Chafurka's scale of engagement with global or interrelated systems way of seeing the world. One of the reasons I wanted to invite Melody, hi,
Hi.
to be here on the Poetry of Predicament is really from the first time you introduced yourself, as we all were doing in the first circle of the first Saturday, all the way through. You had a way of articulating whatever your response was, whatever was emerging for you that you wanted to share. You had an extraordinary ability to articulate your inner state. And it's not just about being conversant or having a lot of personal growth experience, which I'm sure you've had. But as we've mentioned with each other a few times, that these times are different, and we're going to be talking a little bit about that because you have an extensive body of work, and it seems like it started out in a kind of a smaller fashion, and it has grown and deepened tremendously over time, and that's where that articulation came from. So again, we're gonna get to that, and I'm excited to really let you do the vast majority of the talking. But I really wanted people to get a sense of why you're here. I've from time to time have done this in the Poetry of Predicament, where I've redoubled my efforts to make it clear why I'm having a certain type of guest on almost all year long. And I've had year-long trends of people who I consider to be exemplars of what kind of self-regulation and co-regulation and resilience skills, what kind of depth of understanding of the human condition and some of the dynamics that are going on both individually and collectively. And of course, I say that you fit that bill. And so Melody, it's great to have you here. Thank you for having me on your podcast.
You bet.
And just previews of coming attractions. While I absolutely want to hear about each step of whatever you'd like to share with us about your progression through your, the development of your body of work. But my leaning for quite some time now has been not only in the energetics, which is a part of everything you do, but in the particularly in the energetics and the psychology of and the psychospiritual aspects of being around death and dying and loss,
Right.
which again is, as far as I'm concerned, really the culmination of what an exemplar in these times, one of those skills that an exemplar would have. So with all that said, thank you so much for coming on. Hi.
Hi.
And would you please fill in any gaps that you'd like? Start us wherever you'd like to give us just a sense of what got you here.
Oh, well, um, my relationship with the land is what got me here. And I've had the privilege, I'm 67 years old, and I've had the privilege of having 30 homes around the US and Canada in my 67 years. We moved a lot when I was young. And so there was a lot of experience as the oldest of the 7 children that I had with my mother of packing and unpacking and organizing, which led directly to my first body of work, which was helping people get rid of clutter and get themselves organized. But what I will say about those early years is that I noticed wherever we lived that there were differences. And I didn't necessarily have the language or the terminology that I do now, but I could tell even as a young child that inside some of these homes that we moved to, and we rented until my dad finally finished his degree when I was 9 years old. When I was 9 years old was the first home that my parents bought. And so in some of these homes, I could feel inside the home, the heartbeat, the hum, the pulse of the land. And in other homes, it was dense, it was darker energy, it was more stagnant, and I couldn't feel the nature energy inside the structure, inside the body of the home, which meant, of course, that I was outside a lot, playing and being on the land with my bare feet. And, I feel really blessed that I was born into a time where it was safe for children to be running around outside. And my mother was so otherwise occupied, having 7 children, that she would just send us out and call us back for lunch and dinner. And so that was a glorious, I have glorious memories of being on the land. And at one point, so the only home, because we moved so much, the only home I've ever experienced was that for a year during my childhood, between 4 and 5, and then every other summer, sometimes every summer, we would go back to where my parents grew up, which was the prairie land in southern Alberta, Canada. And on one of these trips, I must have been 7 or 8, we were up in the Canadian Rockies, and we were there, and we were at the end of our trip, we were coming down, and we begged my parents, it was around 10:30 in the morning, and we begged my parents to stop before we got down out of the mountains to have our picnic lunch. And my mother said, "You'll be hungry later. It's only 10:30. We begged. And so we had our peanut butter and jelly sandwiches sitting by the water as it rushed down from the mountains. And the hum of and the pulse of the mountains was so strong in my body. And I remember looking at my dad, who became a world-renowned scientist. And I said, "Daddy, do you feel that in your body?" And he said, "Yes." Now, he's not alive anymore. I can't ask him. Do you remember that moment? Did you really know what I was referring to? But because he said yes, because he felt something, I assumed everyone did. And it wasn't until many decades later that I realized that so many of us have been so indoctrinated by the overculture to focus on things other than the pulse of nature as it moves through our bodies, as we welcome it into our bodies. So really, I feel like so much of what I do was informed by those early experiences, some of them really happy, like that one, and some of them not so happy. And so I grew up with this innate understanding that each area that we live, each geographical area, I consider myself to have had a vast spiritual geography. And each area has its own unique gifts that we are either receiving in any given moment or blocking. And that not only is that true of the land on which we live, it's also true of the homes in which we live. So just as the body of the land has spirit moving through it, so do the bodies of our home have spirit moving through them. And I consider spirit to be another name for intelligence or consciousness. Yeah, and so I started my career as a professional organizer. And then 20 years ago, during a Kundalini yoga teacher training, my natural sensitivity to my clients' homes and to the spaces I was working in became more heightened. And I began to see things that had happened in the space, like almost like watching a movie. I began to see things unfolding. And then as I worked with my clients and they shared the story, what I was seeing and sensing was confirmed. And I realized that these memories that were playing out in the space were having an adverse effect on my clients. Because just like when we get into our own trauma loop mentally and things replay in our brains that can have a limiting effect on our consciousness and on our lives, the same thing is we're affected by the space we live in and what's replaying there. And so I realized, well, I can't haul this memory out to the dumpster along with the rest of the clutter. How do I help my clients get rid of this? And that is when I did some research and decided to train with the Australian author and teacher, Eric Dowsett. So I did 5 years of practitioner training with Eric Dowsett with space clearing, and then with Jean Hainer with feng shui. And so something you should know about me is that how I approach things and my initial approach is a very practical, let's look at what is needed at the physical level. Because I started with, let's get rid of the clutter and organize what we need to keep. And I have a lot of training and background, neuro-linguistic programming, brain gym, all kinds of ways to work with clients who've had brain injury or stroke or any kinds of issues that might have resulted in an accumulation of items they're no longer using or loving. And so these energetic ways of partnering with the space to release what no longer serves, including the memory that might be held inside the body of a home. All of this is something I bring to bear with a really practical approach. And I will say that 32 years ago yesterday, on June 1st, 1990, my mother died in my arms after a 16-year experience with cancer. And I had what is now being called a shared death experience. And that, you know, during that year leading up to her death, I was doing a lot of research. I was consulting with experts. We were one of the first families in North Carolina to use hospice, as the doctor called it, this new thing called hospice. And so I received a tremendous education that then 10 years later, during my Kundalini yoga teacher training, where so much of what we learned was about the death process. Remember, in yoga, the pose you do in every single class at the end, at least at the end of every single class, is Shavasana, corpse pose. All of yoga is a preparation for the moment of death. So the death mysteries have unfolded themselves to me as I supported my mother in 1990, my sister in 95, my 17-year-old son in 1997, and since then, a total of 13 of my closest loved ones and countless clients through the dying process. And so my perspective on this is, oh, and then there's one more thing to understand about me, to understand the framework that I see this time we're living in through. And that is that I was blessed to be born into a fundamentalist Christian family that had very structured, rigid beliefs and doctrine and dogma about what to do and the right way and the, you know, path of perfection and all of this. So I was completely and thoroughly indoctrinated into patriarchy. And in that system, I received a lot of harm as well as a lot of blessing. But it was a significant betrayal by someone I loved dearly and idolized, that at the age of 45, finally helped me to see that it was simply a belief system and that some of it was harmful. And it took me a long time to finally graduate myself out of that system. But the moment I did, all of the trauma and all of the harm that had been done because of the rigidity of this one up, one down system, meaning the masculine over the feminine, but the left brain over the right brain, and man over the earth, and all that that entails. Whenever you live in a dominator culture, and of course, my religion in my family of origin was very significantly enmeshed with that patriarchal, colonialized dominator culture. And whenever you are in an experience like that, it is really a challenge. It's easy to take yourself out of the system, but it's a big challenge to take the system out of you and come into a partnering relationship with everything else that you once held this perspective on. And so it was in those years after I graduated myself from this system that the lessons and the learning really began to culminate. And so my perspective now is that I have used all of that sort of angst, trauma, grief over the harm done to me and those in my care as rocket fuel to propel myself out of a patriarchal one up, one down perspective and into a partnering one with myself, with my own shadow, with the land on which I live, the home in which I live, the loved ones, my clients, and even the processes of death and birth. And I have said my oldest was born in 1976. I've said for decades that the way that a culture views and treats birth and death says everything you need to know about the culture. And we are in the predicament that we're in right now with human-caused climate change because of the way the one up, one down dominator colonialized way that we have imposed our will on situations. And I may not be able to change the overculture by myself, but the more that I adopt a partnering perspective and the more that I share this with my clients and my students, the more that has a ripple out effect.
Okay. That gives us a sense of much of your journey. This question just comes to me because of our earlier conversations and our time together in the course that was specifically pointed at our collective predicament and what are the states of being that we might on the most intimate and psychospiritual levels generate in the face of this global existential challenge. You've been describing your own relationship with the energetics, with the world around you, with the other people around you, and your kind of special brand of sensitivity to those energetics from early on all the way through to now. And I'm curious if have you brought your sensitivity, your way of seeing, if you will, to looking at these larger scale existential level concerns? Because it's one thing when you help a client out in their particular life circumstances, their home, their approaching death, whatever the particulars are. Those are quite intimate circumstances, at really close to home, about as close to home as it gets. I'm curious if you've allowed yourself to kind of turn those sensitivities, that seeing out into the larger scale, because it seems like what you are able to see is where there's perhaps a discordant atmosphere or portion of the circumstances that you're in. You're able to name that, interact with it, and so on. And again, that's an intimate scale. Can you share how is it for you with this level of seeing, with this level of sensitivity, when you look into your own experience, and especially when you open it out to the world at large? Whole different scale. Do you find any threads that bump out to that scale? I hope that's a clear question.
Absolutely. And I have to, because of my sensitivity. During the Gulf oil spill, we had recently moved to Atlanta, and during the entire experience of that, I was having physical sensation in my body. During the tsunami, so I am registering things that are happening to the earth, the body and the soul of the earth, my body, my spirit are registering, right? And I want to be clear that I believe we are all registering these anima mundi, soul of the world experiences, but we aren't all reading them. We don't all understand what we're reading. One of the things I've noticed, I don't have any clients under the age of 30 years old. So early 90s. I don't have any clients under 30 that do not suffer from anxiety. And there are a lot of my clients in the age 40 range that also suffer from anxiety, but they didn't experience it as a child. Their first 10 years were without that anxiety. What I believe is, I believe we're all experiencing this, but we're not all reading it. We're not, and some of us are identifying with it, and we're calling it depression, and we're calling it anxiety. We don't really understand that what's happening is we are in a relationship. And the term anima mundi, as it used to be used before Western civilization, before the Greeks, before the Romans, before Western civilization sort of privatized that term, anima mundi meant the soul, the body and soul of the world of which I and you are a part. And then the word soul was privatized. St. Augustine was one of the ones who privatized it. And patriarchy and colonialization narrows our perspective and our viewpoint and tells us what to focus on, what to look at, the words to use to define our experience. So a lot of what's out here doesn't get understood or looked at or acknowledged. But we can access it. We access it through the right hemisphere of the brain. We access it through the wisdom of the body. We access it through our emotions. And so I used to teach classes at the Y, and I taught them every year. They would have me come back. And I started probably teaching these classes it was maybe about 35 years ago. And I would ask certain questions of every class. And one of the questions I would ask is, do you believe that nature is alive? And if I were to ask you that question, what would you tell me?
I would say, of course.
And I would ask, do you believe that nature is intelligent? And what would you answer that?
I would answer far more intelligent than I.
And the last question is, do you believe that nature is aware of us and can partner with us?
I would say it slightly differently, in that just by definition of us being integral in the web of life, it's built in.
Yeah. So when I first started asking those questions, only a handful of people raised their hand. Yes, I believe nature is alive. Most people didn't raise their hand for nature being intelligent or for nature being aware of us and able to partner with us. That has significantly changed in the last 35 years. Now, most people say, yes, nature is intelligent. And most people, not everyone, acknowledges that nature is aware of them. But most people can begin to comprehend that they are actually in some way a part of nature, right? So they may not understand the web of life the way you and I do. They may not understand the term anima mundi, being the body and soul of the world of which I am a part. But the level of intelligence of this anima mundi intelligence has been increasing. About a decade ago, I was privileged when I lived in Atlanta to attend the Ancient Wisdom Rising conference and literally sit around the fire at the feet of indigenous elders from around the world, whose language for what I had experienced all my life and whose descriptions of their own are just magnificent, magnificent, and have helped me to normalize the experiences that I've had for myself and others. There's such a web of intelligence. So for me, everything that has matter has intelligence, not just what we consider nature, not just the land, not just the mountains and the ocean and the, nature energy, but everything that has matter. So the chairs we are sitting in right now want to fulfill the measure of their creation. There is the elements of creation sing through everything that has matter. And so I use the term body and spirit, body meaning everything that has matter, spirit meaning the consciousness that sings through that matter. And my job is to come into right relationship with everything that has matter and everything that has consciousness. My job is to come into right relationship, to come into partnership with it, and to share with my clients and students how they can do this as well.
Great. That's really beautifully said. I'm curious how, if you could just continue this thread a bit further into your work with people as they approach dying themselves, or they themselves are in some way or another holding space for one of their loved ones who's dying. Can you give us a sense of what you see in those spaces? What tends to be the calling in those spaces? I'll just share for a moment. Some of my experience is that the majority of my experience in hospice situations or in near to death experiences or dying, I've been really blessed with some extraordinary, life-altering experiences of extraordinary luminous states of being showing up in some people. It is certainly not a guaranteed
Not everyone. Right.
shift. So I'm curious if you could share any amount of your experience of what seems to, if there is such a thing as, for the average person approaching dying, is there some kind of consistent calling that you are aware of that speaks to you as someone who's wanting to be of service in this space? Can you share any amount of your seeing and what tends to show up in your seeing?
Definitely. And what I will say, I will preface the discussion of death, which for me is a very sacred process. I will preface that by sharing that one of my friends, Kaylin Castell, who's the world's foremost female shamanic astrologer, uses the term assemblage point of consciousness. She talks about we all are our consciousness for each of us is moving through an assemblage point, right? And that assemblage point can shift and expand and grow throughout our lives as we become more and more aware and conscious and in better relationship with the web of life. So I want to share an early experience that I had. I was a year and 4 months old, and a year and 4 months and 13 days, 13 or 14 days old, when my sister Laura was born. And my parents brought her home from the hospital. I was sitting on the couch when they placed her into my lap. Now, just imagine a year-old child, right? I didn't have language very concretely yet. It was mostly my right brain taking in my experience. And so here is this tiny little newborn placed in my arms, and my parents are there. We're all happy. I received her into my arms and looked into her eyes, and instantly I felt the two of us dancing in our consciousness around the room, right? So the assemblage point of my consciousness at a year and 4 months old was not yet located in coming just through my identity of having this physical body, right? And so I'm dancing through the space with her. We are so happy to be together. And then I look at my parents and I recognize that they are solely focused. Like, I recognize they're not aware of where we are and what we're doing, that this is happening outside. Like, they're so identified with their bodies and their identities that all they can experience is what's happening inside the body. And of course, I had no language for it then. I had none whatsoever. But I recognized that their attention was in a very different place than mine. I did not realize, however, so then I was, let's see, how old was I? I was 2 years old. I was 3 years old when my sister Nancy was born, or almost 3. And then I was 4 years old when my brother Robert was born. And, you know, on it goes. I was 16 when number 7 came home. I got to bring him in my arms before car seats home from the hospital. And with each newborn that was placed in my arms, I had that experience of expansion. It wasn't until I married my husband 20 years ago and I said something to him about, you know, that marvelous feeling of expansion when you hold a newborn that you feel. And he was like, I don't know what you're talking about. When I hold a newborn, I'm just scared that I'm going to drop it. And I realized, oh, okay, not everyone has this. But in order for me to talk about death, I have to recognize that the yogis understand that life with a capital L, like what we would call life, is not the same as birth. That birth and death are the portals through which life flows, right? And so at that moment when my sister Laura was born and I held her in my arms and my consciousness expanded with hers outside of our bodies and we were dancing in the space, there was some recognition, there was some awareness that we'd been together before, or we had known each other in a different way before. All right, so now I'm going to fast forward to when I was 35 years old and I was holding my mother in my arms. I was literally feeling her pulse as she died. And what happened, because my attention was so intimately on her. And for the year preceding her death, I lived 6 hours away, and I would drive 6 hours each way to spend a week every month with my mother, caring for her, to give my sisters who were in town a break. And I would walk in, and instantly I would know where to place my hands. Now, this was before I even had Reiki, but I knew where to put my hands and where to offer love and touch and warmth. And she would say, Melody, how do you know? I'm not even communicating to you where I'm hurting. How do you know the right place to put your hands? And I said, I don't know. I just do it. Love tells me, you know. And so I was so intimately connected that as she died, I felt her consciousness go into a tunnel that I knew was in what the yogis now, I had a 10 years afterwards in my yoga training, I got the word for it, the Sushumna, the central nerve channel of the spine is this tunnel. And I knew that the light that she was seeing and moving towards was here, right at the crown. And so I saw her and felt as she emerged from this tunnel, but I knew that while she was in this tunnel, she was receiving a life review, and everything time had stopped. It was only moments for us, it was moments, but she had all the time she needed for that life review. And then as she emerged, I both felt and saw her being embraced by others in the room, above us in the room. And I never met her dad because he died when she was 5 years old, but I recognized him, not just from the pictures I had seen, but from the love in their embrace. And then there were others who were in the room that I recognized who had died before my mother. And so, you know, meanwhile, I'm having my own experience. So she's rejoicing, but we are now grieving. I have announced to my father and my sisters that she's gone. And we're all crying. And then she becomes aware of us, and she turns around, and one at a time, I see her as this being of light, and I see her opening her heart and pulsing a stream of love into each of us. And one at a time, it's like our tears stopped midair, and we looked at each other, and we were like, do you feel her joy? All of us felt her joy. And we just basked in that joy. I was the only one who saw the welcome team. I was the only one who saw her enter the tunnel and have that life review, but all of us experienced the joy. And then after several moments, we all felt her and them depart. My brothers were not in the room with us, and we knew that she had gone to be with them, my brothers and one sister. And sure enough, by the time we called them, they knew she was gone because she had let them know. Now, there's books that have been written about these kinds of shared death experiences. The most recent one, my colleague William Peters published a series of stories called Hello from Heaven. But this experience of being present at death was only matched in its majesty and grace, as well as the messiness, as my experiences giving birth. So these portals of birth and death are just portals through which life flows. Yeah. And I completely understood that at the age of 35. And it changed my assemblage point. And it's changed the way I move in the world and live my life, because in every moment, I am preparing to have the kind of good death that I saw my mother have, that you referenced, that luminosity that happens when we come into acceptance of this is that life is calling me now through this portal of death. And is there fear? Is there fear in those moments? Absolutely. Absolutely. And there's fear. There was fear for me as the child losing the mother. And so I had to work through that fear in those moments when I was not with my mother, so that I could be fully present for what was happening at this portal. It is these moments of death are among the most sacred moments that I've ever experienced. They are only matched. I have been present for the births of two beautiful beings besides my own 5 children. And, you know, those of us who have an assemblage point that allows for the more than human, the more than mortal experience to flow through, these portals are incredibly powerful. So what I would say to people is if your assemblage point is closed and you've never had an experience that leads you to understand life beyond birth and death, be willing for that assemblage point to open up, start to seek those experiences. And I mean, one of the best things I can recommend is your course. Because outside of these moments of birth and death, and outside of my own circles, I facilitate women's circles, empowerment circles. I've never had an experience of such power and presence and love and grace, especially not on Zoom, as I did in your course, Dancing at the Edge, Resilience for the Collapse Aware. It was just profound. So for people who want to open their assemblage point and get some skill in this, yes.
Wow, very kind words, and I so appreciate that. And you're now introducing some new words to this conversation. Not new to me, but I am assuming if I were to speak with this shamanic astrologer, which I'd love to do, and to hear how you're now defining assemblage point, sounds like it might be significantly different and with some similarities. And one of the pieces that particularly comes to mind, I hope the dog barking in the background is not too disturbing. Something about the assemblage point, as I see it on both the individual and collective level, is that it is rigidified. How it shows up for the average person and for this culture globally is that it prides itself on holding itself in place, and that anything that threatens to move it, anything that threatens to bring that, what I call liquid state, which to me, and I think I'm hearing the same in you, is actually the preferred state. That's being alive. That's having a way of being luminescent in the face of the largest stressor that a person might ever have experienced. But how the assemblage point shows up in my view is in that rigidity, and that it experiences anything that threatens to liquefy it, to move it in any significant way, is a threat to life itself. Hence, is it possible that we have some violence going on that's a reactive, kind of a knee-jerk reaction unmetabolized grief, unmetabolized life. I wonder if we could possibly find, if we looked real hard, could we find a culture that tends to lead with its domination and with its colonization and with its delivery of trauma and violence? I'll keep looking. I'm not quite sure if there's anything going on like that in the world today. And of course, for those who aren't quite used to my odd humor, I'm being as ironic as I possibly can. And I'd like to just, we don't have a whole lot of time in this remaining conversation. I would love to plant a seed for future conversations. So hopefully that will be okay with you. There was something about the articulation of the portal of both at birth and at death. And there is so much overlap in your experience and my own. I think we're just going to discover there's a massive terrain that we share. It's, at least they're neighborhoods that butt right up against each other.
Yes.
And I did quite intentionally bring as much of an experience as can be shared with people from all walks of life and energetic life, like portal, what portal, or and for a person who's brand new to these conversations, is there a way to have them be able to just put their hands right up into that fuzzy boundary, that's liminal space that you're talking about, and actually come back and be able to articulate some of it, right? And that was my experience of putting together the combination of various pieces that I did put into the course, but also with the wider embraces piece from Stina Durrell, in Swedish woman who just created this most gentle exposure or disclosure, energetic disclosure of these massive spaces that one can visit without even realizing we're going through the portal that you're talking about. So you did hold up your book, and I want to hear how you might wrap it up for us, perhaps with that. I just wanted to mention, you were kind enough to mention your experience of the work in the recent course. It was my experience as well. And it was really just trusting that we don't have to wait until we've had a lifetime of experiences that I've experienced, that I've heard you now describe, that there may be these openings. I certainly hope against hope that there are these openings available at scale for us. So you were just holding up your book. Would you say a little bit about that and wrap this up for us?
Well, years ago when I first started, I was asked 20 some years ago to speak to the Central Florida End of Life Conference. So hospice doctors, physicians, nurses, caregivers, and everyone was like, wow, there's so much more written about death, but there's nothing like what you are describing of partnering with the process of death and allowing the room to be a partner in this space. So this is a culmination of those wisdom teachings, but it's called Transforming Death, Creating Sacred Space for the Dying. What I will say is, and this book is an experience, I share my experience with the deaths I've midwifed as I introduce the concepts, but this is a way of being present with and for yourself and those you care about at the portal of death. And when we look at the overculture, I'm not talking right now about climate change. I'm just talking about the structures and systems in the United States and all Western civilization. We see that we are at the portal of death.
Yes.
We see old patriarchal structures coming apart because they must. They are not sustainable. And so if we can bring an attitude of reverence, if we can expand the way we're seeing what's happening now in the news, and then we can even expand that to what's happening with the body and the soul of the world of which we are a part, and we can expand our perspective and the beautiful skills that you shared with us in the course, Dancing at the Edge. If we can bring an open heart, a skill set of an open heart and an open mind, what we can experience is connection, community, resilience. We can be resourced. And when we ourselves are resourced, then we have open hearts. We have something to give.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Melody LeBaron, it's obvious to me that there's way more than just a couple of podcast interviews going on here. It is wonderful to be putting these cornerstones in place for a shared language and a number of shared layers of experience. And I'm just couldn't be more excited about the possibility of us. I don't know if it's collaboration. I don't know if there's a chance that you might be interested in being a part of this online community, this Mighty Networks thing that I'm putting together. Whatever it ends up being, I was mentored a while back, actually decades ago, to find my people. That as time goes on, it will become more and more important. And so this again was more than 2 decades, actually more than 3 decades ago. And they made a point of saying, and the longer you wait, the more difficult, yet more important it will be. So now is well down the line, and it is more important than ever. And I just feel such an affinity, such a resonance with what you and I both are bringing to this conversation and to our own expressions, our own work. It's really just been a joy talking with you. I love the layer we got to today. And if you don't mind, I'm just going to bug you on a regular basis to have more of these conversations and see if there isn't something that wants to get brought forth in some sort of collaboration. It just feels
I would
really,
love that.
really good.
It does. It feels very important. And what's interesting as you speak about what you're creating with Mighty Networks, during my yoga teacher training 22 years ago, the web of Indra was described. And I had this sensation, not just visual, but an actual kinesthetic sensation of being a light in this network or web of all these, at every intersection of consciousness, there's this light. And, you know, the Dancing at the Edge was an experience of that kind of connection. And these conversations you and I have had, same thing. And we shine brighter. We are ourselves more luminous when we recognize that our grid is connected with these other grids around the world. And so I'm very interested in, let's explore what can happen. Explore.
Well, I know you're going to go on some journeys soon. They just sound so exciting. I can't wait to hear stories. So thank you for taking time as you're trying to get ready for those travels. And I'm envious as can be. It's been way too long since I've, well, for all of us who are used to traveling, to be able to do that again. Thank you so much. It has just been a joy to talk with you.
You're welcome.
Thanks for watching another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. Music today from Michael Hedges, as always, and also Port Blue Into the Sea. Also available on our website, www.livingresilience.net, is a wide array of articles, online learning series, arranging group and individual resilience coaching, and sign up for our every other Tuesday free support group that we call Safe Circle Calls.